Thank you um, for all of you who are reading, Jeff and Toby and Brooke. Peacemaking to me means working together with God to create or build more shalom in the world, more wholeness, more restoration, more completeness, more righted relationships. So I think to see peace building or peacemaking as part of shalom building also means understanding that justice is part of that. Righted relationships, wholeness, restoration, reconciliation can't happen if we don't first find space to see what is unjust, what is wrong, what has been broken, what has been lost. Otherwise, if we jump to reconciliation and attempt restoration, we actually are doing just the opposite. We're keeping the peace, but maybe not bringing shalom or true peace. We're not adjusting or transforming things to create lasting peace and shalom. And this is what Jesus did, the peacemaking. He moved in ways that brought about shalom in communities, in situations, and life for all. And he didn't do that by keeping the peace, so to speak, but actually by ruffling some feathers. These scriptures that were read may not be traditional ones that we use to talk about peace or being peacemakers. Yet I think it shows us how Jesus moved in the world, how he brought peace, how he was a peacemaker, bringing more shalom. These are just a few of the examples recorded in all of the Gospels. And the four that we heard today, in each instance, Jesus is agitating a bit. But it's not for the sake of being right or for agitation or for showing others up, or sometimes even it's not just about the individual circumstances. But rather in each scenario, Jesus is bringing about more shalom, more restoration, restoring something that was lost or broken, creating pathways for righted relationship, for community. We may think about it as being, he's bringing this most directly for those with less social agency in the story, or those who are overlooked or outcast. But really, this transformation is for the whole community. It's for everyone to see life differently. Systems, institutions, and people. Jesus was being a peacemaker, but not necessarily in a way that kept things comfortable. So in the first portion that we heard read from Mark, Jesus was challenging what the Sabbath had become, was intended to give life to the community, not to put more burden. And yet the system that was in place at this time was not life-giving. And so here we see Jesus challenging the leaders, saying, is it permitted to do a good deed on the Sabbath or an evil one, to preserve life or to destroy it? And then in the next story, when Jesus was healing someone with unclean spirits, who was literally living among the tombs, was far from being a part of that community or being seen with dignity. The healing that Jesus gives restores both the dignity and humanity to the person. And by removing the spirits, Jesus removes the barrier to belonging to community. Jesus gives this person a path forward in becoming more integral part of this community. This was true for most, if not all, of the times Jesus heals someone. And then in the third passage, we know that children were not really an essential part of the society, or were just overlooked. They were part of it, obviously, but they weren't acknowledged. And yet here Jesus was acknowledging and blessing them. He wanted to be near them. This is just one of the examples of Jesus wanting to be around those who were often overlooked or outcast. And just by giving his focus to them, he gave them dignity and allowed other people to see them in a different light. Again, changing the perspective for the whole community, transforming what was broken. And of course, in the last passage, I feel like we talk about this one maybe more so than others, with Jesus overturning the tables. He's restoring equity again in this system that had been, or he's trying to, we don't know what happened after that. This system had created hardships for those with the least voice or the least economic resources. And in that, others were profiting off of that hardship. I'm not going to go in depth in each one of those. We'll just do kind of an overview, because I want to get to another part that has been challenging me too in my peacemaking. But if I am following Jesus' lead in being a peacemaker and bringing more shalom, then I need to recognize where I am. As a white, middle-class, cisgendered person, it is incumbent on me to also expand my understanding of where shalom is needed in our society and world, to understand the realities of others who are not benefiting from the same systems I may be, or not being brought into community in the same way I have been. So I have been trying to learn from a non-dominant point of view or experience, and to begin to name that as part of my peacemaking. Whether it's through books or seminars or just listening more intently in circles and settings with colleagues and friends. And so this past week, last week I decided that during this week I was going to read the book, Sarah Augustine's book called The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. And I was going to be intentional in using that for my sermon prep. She is a Pueblo descendant that grew up knowing nothing of her background, language, and culture. This was due directly to her father being removed from his mother and people as an infant and placed in a Catholic boys' home. She grew up actually with no relatives on either side of her family. She states she grew up an urban Indian, not registered in a tribe with the federal government. Quote, like many indigenous people who dwell in North America, I am the product of a diaspora. The history, language, tradition, and genetics of my people were wrenched from a place and thrown to the wind, divided for all time. She has now, over the last 15 years, been working with partner indigenous communities, primarily in South America, and calling attention to how international laws are built, continued to be built, on the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, which gave white Europeans the legal and religious means to steal land from the indigenous people here in North America. And this continues, actually, for indigenous peoples across the world, due to mining and extracting corporations are being given legal rights to extract and contaminate their land. Land that in most cases is still not legally theirs, but is their government's. Sarah began to understand her own life experiences more as she began working with indigenous peoples in Suriname, a coastal country in the northern part of South America. She began to understand the scope of the doctrine of discovery, and that the poverty and the unstable family she experienced was directly tied to those laws that created the impulse to, quote, kill the native and save the child. She was a generation removed from that, but was living in those repercussions of both her parents not knowing their language, their native culture or having community. In her book, she calls on the broader church to together keep trying to dismantle the doctrine of discovery internationally. I highly recommend her book. It's in depth, and sometimes you have to read things over because she goes into how these laws are put into place and how it affects each of the communities that she's talking about. But as I was reading it, it also reminded me that it was beginning to change the way I see peacemaking. I realized that I still see with a Western individualistic lens. That's what I was brought up with. It's hard to change that. And that was also transferring into peacemaking, that I bring peace. I bring my knowledge, my instincts, my understandings to a situation. What would happen if I think about it in a more cooperative or collective wisdom piece? What gift or good news am I missing by not expanding my worldview in a more collective way? And so I'm going to share a few snippets from her book this morning that are things that are challenging me. I honestly just finished the book on Saturday, yesterday morning, so I am still processing. But I invite you to process with me. This will be ongoing. First off, she names one of the things that was challenging to me is the piece around how we see our actions as individuals rather than collective. She says the dominant culture in our country is highly individualistic. We have been socialized to see problems as individual ones, and as our interventions are often individualistic. Recycling, buying an electric car, giving money to famine relief, providing money so an indigenous child in Suriname can attend a boarding school in the city. When faced with a social issue, our first inclination is often to ask, what can I do? What individual action can I take to help? While it is often important to take these individual level actions because they do relieve some suffering, our most vexing social issues are not going to be solved by individual actions. We are ensnared in sinful global systems that cause great suffering, suffering that is completely hidden to most of us most of the time. This is structural sin. Not the sin of an individual, the sin of a system. It is by far the most prevalent sin in which we participate. It is not the sin of intentional or willful cruelty. Neither is structural sin the kind of sin we can lay at the feet of particularly greedy or racist individuals, as if by removing them from power or converting them, the suffering will go away. Rather, structural sin is sin that inhabits our lives by virtue of the policies, practices, institutions, and assumptions that shape how we live. It is sin so baked into the system, so much a part of how things are, that it is largely hidden, unseen except by those suffering from it. And sometimes not even then, because of the power of the system to blind even those oppressed by it to the true cause of the suffering. Once we see the structural nature of what we are dealing with, I believe we can then turn away from feelings of guilt. Guilt is an individualistic response to what is perceived as an individualistic problem. Once we realize that we are all involved in structures that are sinful, we can instead focus more productively on dismantling the structures that manufacture inequity. That's challenging to me. It feels daunting, and yet she names many different ways for us to join together as church institution, church congregations to pressure and work towards dismantling some of the things that are happening for Indigenous people around the world. One challenge she has is to all of us, as long as we have retirement accounts, all of us benefit from extracting corporations, mining and extracting corporations. And she names some of us actually may have stocks in different companies. She is not calling for disinvestment, because if we have a way to pressure the company to work and negotiate directly with the Indigenous peoples, that is better than disinvesting, because then we have no power and someone else will pick up the stock. She also names that if we are making money from investments, it is unjust to keep the money. Investments in extractive industry, in gold mining, in other mining and extracting industries. She names that you can invest the money in the communities being harmed by extractive industries like gold mining, oil and gas drilling. And she has more concrete ways to also do that. She also has looked into Everence, our own Mennonite organization, and while they try to not invest, ethically, there is still, because of the larger system, there are still, if your investments are through Everence, you are still investing in extracting companies at times. The other thing she brought out is this idea that we in the dominant society usually ask or blame the most vulnerable for their suffering. Let me find that. She describes the mining in Suriname, where there are smaller scale miners that use mercury that is, efficient and cheap to get the gold out, but technically illegal. But the large scale mines hold the land concessions. And so the government doesn't police those areas. They allow the large scale mines to do the policing of, like, don't use mercury because it is harmful for the environment and for the people that live there. But the large scale mines benefit financially because they charge taxes on the smaller miners who use the mercury. He was saying once an area of a river has been mined, the pools created during the mining process are abandoned. Those pools contain heavy metals and toxic chemicals, including mercury. They also create the perfect environment for mosquitoes to reproduce. The coastal area of Suriname has been effectively free of malaria since 1968. However, indigenous and tribal peoples who live in the interior region have more recently been plagued by malaria. The chief intervention strategy has been to train indigenous and tribal peoples to use treated mosquito nets. Focusing on individual level behavior modification implies that individuals get sick because either they choose not to protect themselves or they don't know how. The solution seems simple. Train the people to use mosquito nets and they will be safer. In reality, mosquitoes that carry and transmit malaria are able to flourish in the pools of standing water left by gold mining. Malaria flourishes unchecked in the regions where gold mining occurs. Mining itself is the cause. This example illustrates the propensity of the dominant culture to blame individuals, often the most vulnerable, for their own suffering. This also had me thinking about gun violence in our own city and in our own nation. What is our dominant narrative to those who suffer the most? Are we thinking about what's underneath the epidemic of gun violence? What's causing it, rather than assuming that we can give an individualistic answer to the communities who are suffering the most from it? And lastly, I just want to say that she also talks about the spirituality of Indigenous peoples. And for me, that meant, it helped me to remind myself that we need to stay connected to God, that peacemaking is not just action, but being grounded in God's love and working together with God. She talks about reverence being one of the aspects of an Indigenous spiritual experience, that they are often accused of worshiping the creation rather than the creator. But really, the basis of Indigenous spirituality is reverence. Expressing reverence for the spirit of life, the creator, by finding elements of the creator's nature in the sun, faithful, unfailing, giver of light, giver of life. She continues to say, I see the faithfulness of the creator with each season. In spite of the consistent inputs from herbicides and pesticides, nitrates and effluent, carbon emissions that are changing our climate, hydropower that pollutes, divides, and diminishes watersheds. In spite of our collective efforts, each spring, life returns to the soil. Trees and plants flower, and pollinators do their important work to spread the miracle of life. We humans do nothing to earn this. We do not collectively give thanks, yet each spring returns faithfully, and with it, life. She goes on to say that reverence doesn't happen once a week, but happens moment by moment, every day, reminding me to be more aware every day of God's presence around me. I'm going to end there and leave and have her voice be closing us out. But I want to say that peacemaking continues to evolve if we continue to understand shalom and the realities of people around the world that are different than ours, the places where shalom is needed more, where righted relationships are needed, where restoration is needed, where what is broken needs mended. And that collectively we can do this. We can find ways to work together. So in Sarah's words, our work is not easy, but it is profoundly necessary. The survival of life on Earth depends on our ability to see past the reality designed to diminish us and justify the systems of death. We must find the courage to seek, create, and invent a reality consistent with the logic of life. Do not live in fear. Walk in certainty, in the nobility of a mighty spirit which you share with all creation. It is your right, your birthright, to seek out others to work toward a world you imagine, a world where we all are free. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lorie. Now we're going to have our song of response, one of our congregational favorites, I think. How can we be silent?